Our next session has to do with the Austrian School view of the business cycle. We have two participants in the debate, Professor Bloch and Stephen Kirchner. As I say, I'll be mercifully brief so that we can maximize the time spoken by other people other than myself. As a very brief way of introduction, we've heard Professor Bloch's background. Dr. Kirchner is in the Department of Econ at University of Technology here in Sydney, also a senior fellow at the Center for Independent Studies, and well known for the website institutionaleconomics.org, I think it is? Beg your pardon. My fancy gadget here had the rules for the debate. Let me run them through very, very briefly. Each of our participants will have a 15-minute overview. Each participant will then, on the basis of what the other has said, a 10-minute rebuttal. And then finally, each speaker will have 5 minutes to rebut the rebuttals and then open for young and old questions from the audience. Very, very briefly, the Austrian conception of the business cycle, its origins, is one of the characteristics for which the Austrian school is well known. In one respect, I think that's unfortunate. The Austrian school imparts much, much more than that. But in a sense, it is fortunate because that theory of the business cycle brings to bear much of what is distinctive in the Austrian school. To be, again, very, very brief, the origins lie in the work of Karl Menger in the late 19th century, and then elaborated greatly by Mises, particularly in the theory of money and credit. German edition 1912, English translation circa 1950-something, and then some elaborations much more recently than that. So with no further ado, let me introduce then Professor Bloch to give his view for 15 minutes.
In the view of most economists, the economy is sort of like a car. Either it goes too fast or it goes too slow. And if it goes too fast, the government's got to put on the brakes. If it goes too slow, unemployment, the government's got to hit the gas pedal. Too fast would be inflation, too slow would be unemployment. The main difference within economics, within mainstream economics, is between the Keynesians and the monetarists. And the big difference between them is, should the brakes or the gas be money or should it be fiscal policy? And the left-wing Keynesians say that it should be fiscal policy, and the right-wing Keynesians, such as Milton Friedman, say it should be monetary policy. To Austrians, this is a distinction with not much of a difference, because both believe in market failure, both believe that the economy is incapable of managing itself. Both believe that the economy will either veer into inflation or unemployment, and that the government's got to fix it. The only big difference is how to fix it. And in my view as an Austrian, that's not much of a difference. I don't really care how these guys think you can fix the economy, because I don't think you need to fix the economy. I think the economy, that is laissez-faire capitalism, not crony capitalism, but the true marketplace is not perfect, because it's composed of human beings, and human beings aren't perfect, but it always tends toward full employment with no inflation and no problems. And there are no market failures, whether it's in macro or public goods or externalities or any of the other market failures. Now, some people might object to me calling Milton Friedman a Keynesian, but Samuelson, a left-wing Keynesian, quoted Milton Friedman, a right-wing Keynesian, and Milton said, we're all Keynesians now. I asked Milton Friedman about this, and he said, well, Paul Samuelson misconstrued him. And here is my reconstruction of what Friedman said from Friedman. It's my paraphrase. He said something to the effect that when it comes to public policy analysis, namely, should it be monetary policy or fiscal policy, there are gigantic differences between us and the Keynesians. But when it comes to the tools of analysis, quote, we're all Keynesians now. This was what Samuelson quoted him as saying, and I thought that was pretty accurate, because I think the tools of analysis are more important than the public policy prescriptions, because the public policy prescriptions presumably emanate from the tools of analysis. So if you're a Keynesian in terms of tools of analysis, then you're a Keynesian, period. The problem that Austrians have with this is, one problem is stagflation. Suppose you have both. Now, Arthur Burns, Murray Rothbard's mentor at Columbia, was once asked this before the advent of stagflation, namely, suppose you have unemployment and inflation together. That's what stagflation is. Then what do you do? And Burns said, oh, well, then we'll all resign. And everyone laughed because you couldn't have that. But you can have it, and we've had it. They should all resign. If the Austrian view is correct, that the economy will move at roughly the right speed, and if it's going too slow, there are forces within it to speed it up, namely get rid of unemployment. If it's going too fast, there's inflation, there are forces to slow it down within it. Well, then why do we have unemployment and inflation, or unemployment or inflation? Why do we have the depression, the business cycle, recession, bad things? And the Austrian answer is the reason we have these bad things is because government has interfered with the economy. How has government interfered with the economy? Let me list a few of the ways. It has a fiat currency instead of gold. It has a fractional reserve banking, Fed, central banking, legal tender laws, the FDIC. Did I mention the Fed? I have to say it again because of Ron Paul. Minimum wage law creates unemployment. Unions, unemployment insurance is a way of subsidizing unemployment. So of course you're going to get unemployment if you subsidize unemployment through unemployment insurance. Tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariff really screwed things up in the 1930s. There's all sorts of uncertainty over tax policy, socialized medicine. So there's no need for central planning in the monetary sphere any more than there's need for central planning in any other sphere in the Austrian view. Now, the paradox where Austrians are out of step with the mainstream philosophy or the mainstream school is we see the boom as a bad thing and the bust as a good thing, whereas everyone else sees the boom as good and the bust as bad. We see the boom is sort of like someone getting drunk, and next day when he has a hangover and he's sick and he's throwing up, that's good. Not that we enjoy bad things, but the body has to cleanse itself, and you do that by vomiting, perhaps getting rid of the poisons in your body. For the Austrian, it's not a matter of too much or too little aggregate demand. And we're neither supply-siders nor demand-siders nor anything like that. Austrianism is a misallocation theory of the business cycle. Namely, Austrianism doesn't say that we have too much or too little. It says we don't have the right investments. Now, let me illustrate this through interest rates. There is such a thing called present discounted value. What this means is how much is a dollar worth receivable in a year from now at a certain interest rate, and assuming you'll get the money for sure, and there's no inflation. So how much would you people bid for a dollar? I promise to give you this dollar here in a year from now, and you can trust me. I'm just sort of like Cartman from South Park. I guess that one didn't go over too well. It's a U.S. program. You must watch it. It's my favorite TV show. You can trust me. I will give you this dollar in a year from now for certainty, and there will be no inflation. And what would the equilibrium bid for a dollar receivable in a year from now? It depends on the interest rate. If the interest rate is 3%, then you'll discount it down to roughly 97 cents, because if you put 97 cents in the bank right now and leave it in the bank at 3%, in a year you'll get $1. So that's the idea of present discounted value. So what is the present discounted value? If the interest rate is 4%, it's 96 cents. What's the present discounted value if the interest rate is 3%? 97 cents. So when the government artificially lowers the interest rate from 4% to 3%, what it does is it encourages investment in both of these things, because it makes, it encourages investment in an investment project of 1 year's duration, because it increases the value of it by about 1%. Namely, instead of an investment being worth 96 cents now, it's worth 97 cents. So there will be a slight move toward investments of a one-year duration. Well, what about an investment, a long-term investment of 70 years, and I'm now consulting my interest rate tables, and take it from me that the present discounted value of $1 receivable in 70 years from now is 6 cents, whereas $1 receivable in a year from now at 70 years from now at 3% is 12 cents. Namely, it doubled. You get it? So the artificial lowering of the interest rate encouraged short-term investment by a teensy tiny amount, whereas it encouraged long-term investment by a gigantic, humongous amount. And entrepreneurs, led by the invisible hand, will then tend not so much to invest in short-term projects, but in long-term projects, houses and cars, things like that. But the interest rate is determined by the saving and consumption decisions of the consumers, namely by their time preference. How impatient are they for the present versus the future? And if the market interest rate was 4% and the government artificially lowers it to 3%, well, then entrepreneurs are led by an invisible hand, but they're led in the wrong way. They're led in the direction of making too much long-term investment and not enough short-term investment. But this is unsustainable. The government can't keep doing this by increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates, because if it does, you're going to have Germany 1923 or Zimbabwe. So eventually, Hayek calls it catching a tiger by the tail. Eventually, you're in trouble if you've got a tiger by the tail. Right now, you're safe, but if you let go, the tiger will get you. So what the Austrian view is that it's not a matter of too much or too little, but it's a matter of too much in one spot and too little in another spot. So it's not too much investment or too much spending, it's a misallocation theory. Let me use an analogy. Instead of long-term and short-term investments with interest rates, it's a little hard to grab onto unless you're really into this present discounted value stuff. Let me give a much more simple example. Right now, the government hasn't interfered with the allocation between carrots and shoes. There's no crisis. There's no shoe-carrot crisis. I just made it up. So I assume that the shoe-carrot supply is the way it should be. Because if it weren't, there would be market forces. Like if we had too many shoes and not enough carrots, there'd be market forces to move us out of one and into the other. But suppose government starts supporting carrots and starts taxing shoes, and investments go out of shoes and into carrots. And suppose that this can't last forever. And now what we're left with is too many carrots and not enough shoes. And now we're going to have a recession or a cleansing depression. Namely, we're going to have to get out of carrots, and people in the carrot industry who never should have been in the carrot industry in the first place are going to lose their jobs, and they're going to get jobs in the shoe industry. But the capital goods for the two are not homogeneous. Namely, there are losses if you invest in carrot machines, whatever the carrot machines are. Don't ask me, I'm weak on carrot theory, but I'm just using this as an example. The shoe machinery is different. You just can't melt the one down and make the other costlessly. We're going to be in trouble. Now, the mainstream is okay in terms of housing. What happened was the Boston Fed decided that there was racism going on because blacks of a certain wealth weren't getting as much loans as whites of the same wealth. And they said that the local banks were no good, and what the banks should do is give blacks more mortgages than whites. What happened, Thomas Sowell, I was talking to somebody about Thomas Sowell, and he points out, yes, this is true. The reason is because blacks of the same wealth still didn't have the same creditworthiness as whites of the same wealth. And banks fashion their loans or their mortgages based on not only wealth, but also creditworthiness and past situations of repaying debts. And what Sol points out is that Orientals, or Asians in the Boston area, were getting more loans given their wealth. So it had nothing to do with the racism of white or black or yellow skin, it rather racism of the green color, namely green money. The banks were just acting rationally, giving loans to people who deserved them on the basis of their creditworthiness. But then the Fed and the HUD and Fannie and Freddie and a whole bunch of government regulatory bureaus threatened the banks. They said, unless you give the blacks more loans, we're gonna get you. We're gonna regulate you. And banking is a very heavily regulated industry. So what they started doing is ninja loans. No income, no job, no address. You get a loan anyway. And therefore, we had too much housing, more housing than we would have otherwise had, and then we had a glut of housing. So the mainstream understood that, but they didn't understand that the interest rate also did that. The housing is a very long-term investment. And when you lower the interest rate from 4% to 3%, it's a dramatic change. When you lower the interest rate from 7% to practically zero, it's a gigantic, stupendous change. And then what they started doing is bailing out the housing and cars, and they bailed out Detroit. One of the reasons Detroit was in such trouble is those guys on the assembly line were making $75 an hour if you include the fringe benefits. Well, there's no way that you can compete against Kia or somebody else in Alabama where they're making $15 an hour. We had a very similar situation in 1921 as we had in 1929, 1933. Only in 1921 we had laissez-faire. The government didn't do anything. But Hoover and the FDR had to do something, and what they did is they propped up the carrot industry or the long-term investment industry when we should have had less of it. So to summarize, because I think I'm just coming out of time, we Austrians have a business cycle theory. It's very different than the mainstream. The mainstream thinks that there's a big difference between monetary and fiscal policy. We don't see that at all. We see that both of them have a too much or too little philosophy, whereas our theory is a misallocation theory. And I guess I'll stop at this point.
Well, it's great to be sharing a platform with Walter. Defending the Undefendable was one of the first libertarian books that I ever read, and it still sits on my shelf. It's a great read, and you should all buy a copy if you don't have one already. So I come to this debate very sympathetic to Austrian economics, but very unsympathetic to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, in part because I think it's a significant departure from the disequilibrium tradition in Austrian economics. If we go back to the roots of the theory, it's effectively a merger of Böhm-Bawerk's capital theory with Wicksel's distinction between the natural and the market rate of interest. And there's a great irony here, which is that the Austrian theory of the business cycle actually shares common intellectual roots with new Keynesian models of the role of monetary policy in the business cycle. And so these new Keynesian models are actually often characterised as neo-Wickselian in their focus on deviations in the natural rate of interest from some assumed equilibrium or neutral value. Since money and credit are so central to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, I think it's useful to consider from a normative point of view what relationship we would like to see between the monetary system on the one hand and the business cycle on the other, and then use this as a framework for evaluating different monetary theories and different monetary institutions. From a normative point of view, there's actually considerable agreement amongst different schools of economic thought as to what relationship we want between the monetary system and the business cycle. And that is basically no relationship. We want the monetary system to be neutral as possible with respect to the real economy. So the theoretical and, dare I say it, empirical question becomes what monetary regime or set of monetary institutions gives us a monetary system that is most completely endogenous to economic activity. Now, of course, Austrians argue that some form of free banking will most effectively realise this normative ideal, and I have considerable sympathy for that position. But what I want to try and convince you today is that we're actually very close to this situation already. We're already a large part of the way there, even if this is something that many Austrians refuse to recognise. Murray Rothbard makes a very useful conceptual distinction between what he calls business fluctuations on the one hand and the business cycle on the other. So business fluctuations are the ups and downs in economic activity that you'd expect to see as part of the normal functioning of a market economy. Whereas business cycles are those fluctuations that Austrians attribute to the distortionary effects of our existing monetary institutions. So Rothbard would argue that business fluctuations should not give rise to economy-wide cycles, as opposed to, say, sector-specific fluctuations. But empirically, it may be very difficult to distinguish between the two. One of the important insights from real business cycle theory is the idea that economy-wide fluctuations in activity that we observe may have their origins in technology and other types of real shock that may give rise to random fluctuations in economic activity that look very much like economy-wide business cycles, even if they have sector-specific origins. The processes of Schumpeterian competition and entrepreneurial error may also give rise to business fluctuations that may be indistinguishable from business cycles. We also know, as Walter suggested, there are many government interventions and depredations that may give rise to significant misallocations of resources, and that this misallocation may have macroeconomic effects that again look like business cycles, quite apart from anything the government might be doing in terms of monetary policy. Indeed, Rothbard interprets the Great Depression partly in terms of the cartelisation of the US economy, as well as the effects of monetary expansion. And I think there's now much stronger recognition today than there was in Rothbard's time that the cartelisation of the US economy was a very important factor in prolonging the Great Depression. So Austrians should be very sympathetic to the idea that not all of the ups and downs in the economy are due to monetary factors. But how do we know which is more significant, which is another way of saying, how do we know that the Austrian theory of the business cycle is actually true? There is a very big problem of observational equivalence here that Austrians are mostly reluctant to come to terms with. Now, of course, Rothbard would argue that empirical data cannot resolve this question, but here I think the apodictic Rothbard is somewhat at odds with the Rothbard, the economic historian. If you read Rothbard's work on the Great Depression, it is full of empirical data, and you have to ask the question, what are those data doing in there if they have no relevance to establishing the theory? More recently, we have had the discovery of Mises' lost papers, which show that the so-called daytime Mises was very much the applied empirical economist, in contrast to the so-called nighttime Mises that we were always led to believe was so resolutely anti-empirical. In any case, Mises, in his essay on method, is very clear that we still need to look to empirics to decide which theory is relevant to apply to a particular set of circumstances, even if we cannot use empirical data to test the theory. This is, of course, exactly what Rothbard is doing in referencing so much data in his work on the Great Depression. I think it should be very clear that the Austrian theory of the business cycle is well outside the realm of apodictic certainty, as indeed is any other theory of the business cycle. In America's Great Depression, Rothbard argues, and I quote, "The Austrian analysis of the business cycle continues to operate regardless of the effects of other forces," unquote. Now, this may be true, but that does not mean that it is quantitatively significant compared to those other forces. Austrians too often hide behind methodological strictures, not only to avoid doing empirics, but I'd also argue even to avoid doing theory. It is not enough for a theory merely to be logically coherent. It has to have some explanatory power relative to other theories and not just some loose fit with the stylized facts. As someone who used to do financial market forecasting for a living, I can tell you that the economy does a much better job of forecasting monetary policy than monetary policy does of forecasting the economy. Statistically, at least, monetary policy looks to be largely endogenous to the economy, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. I hasten to add that these were not the relationships I expected to find, given my Austrian sympathies. When I worked in financial markets, I met numerous people who claimed to trade financial markets on the basis of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, although strangely, I was the one who usually ended up paying for lunch. Now, you might say that Austrians don't do prediction, but then you have to explain to me what Peter Schiff is doing on TV. When I look at Fed policy circa 2003, the fact that the Fed had lowered nominal interest rates to 1% does not tell me that monetary policy was too easy. Milton Friedman explained why nominal interest rates are a very poor guide to the stance of monetary policy. What I see is a monetary policy that is completely ineffective. Why else was the Fed lowering interest rates so dramatically and for so long, if not for the fact that this was having so little effect? Indeed, why would we expect anything else? In the US case especially, it should be abundantly clear that the Fed's balance sheet is simply too small relative to the stock of US dollar-denominated marketable securities for monetary policy to have much of an effect on anything outside the narrow confines of the overnight interbank lending market. Even quantitative easing is simply accommodating an increase in the demand for money, which is useful for preventing deflation, but we shouldn't expect much more than that from QE. This is why there is almost no relationship between the Fed funds rate on the one hand and market-determined interest rates on the other, which are determined in globalised, freely trading capital markets. The growth in broad money and credit aggregates is also largely endogenous to economic activity and has very little relationship either with base money or the Fed funds rate. It seems to me that this evidence that monetary policy is ineffective is actually a far more powerful critique of modern central banking than the idea that monetary policy is always and everywhere destabilising. Isn't this the world we want to live in, one in which monetary policy is ineffective and money and credit aggregates are largely determined by market forces? Austrians have put themselves in the odd position of arguing against the results of capitalist acts between consenting adults. They have demonised outcomes that should for the most part be viewed as part of the normal functioning of a market economy. I would argue that independent inflation-targeting central banks have moved us substantially in the direction of endogenised money and credit, and the Austrian critique of central banking has failed to acknowledge the significant progress that has been made in this regard. These developments should be welcome because they show that the ideal of a monetary system endogenised to economic activity can largely be realised even in the framework of existing monetary institutions. I once had a discussion with the then Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Don Brash, who is perhaps the only central bank governor on the public record expressing support for free banking. And Don suggested to me the following thought experiment. Suppose that starting tomorrow, the Fed or the Reserve Bank of Australia stopped intervening in the overnight interbank lending market and we removed all the barriers to competitive note issue on the part of financial institutions. Now, at the time we had this conversation, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand did not routinely intervene in the overnight interbank lending market and conducted monetary policy largely by jawboning market-determined interest rates and the exchange rate. So this thought experiment was not exactly a huge leap of the imagination. I would agree with Don that these are necessary but also sufficient conditions for a market-determined monetary system that is largely endogenous. What would really change if we enacted these reforms? My guess is that the economy would behave in much the same way as it does now. Now, you might point to the continued existence of government spending and taxing and a host of other interventions that may give rise to various economic problems, but that is exactly my point. Those things are far more important than contemporary monetary policy as an influence on the economy. For many Austrians, I think the Austrian theory of the business cycle is not really a business cycle theory at all. It's become a stick with which to beat central banks and to blame them for all the trouble in the world, but I think this is a distraction from more important issues that are far more deserving of our attention. More seriously, if you're going to blame everything that goes wrong on monetary policy, then you're letting off the hook all the other government interventions in the economy that have far more serious consequences than the fact that we have a government-owned financial institution acting as a price maker in the overnight interbank lending market. So before we end the Fed, we need to end Freddie, we need to end Fannie, and all the other depredations that were far more significant as causal factors in the recent financial crisis than monetary policy. Thank you.
I agree with everything Steve said. I'm just kidding. Anyone who likes defending the undefendable can't be all bad. And man, I certainly agree with his opening statement. This is the time where I'm supposed to respond to what he said, so I'll do that, although I had more to say, but this gentleman shut me up, so can't win them all. There's a big debate over free banking. Steve seems to think that all Austrians favor free banking. Now, my understanding is that Selgin and White are free bankers, but all the people at the Mises Institute, Rothbard, Hoppe, myself, whole bunches of other people are against free banking. The issue has to do with fractional reserve banking. In my view, and I have an article co-authored with Guido Holtzman and Hans Hoppe, fractional reserve banking is highly problematic. The way Hans puts it, right now we have 1 million cars, say, in Sydney. And there are 1 million titles to cars in Sydney, to those cars. And if somebody started manufacturing more titles to cars than there were cars, this would be highly problematic, to say the least. And yet that's what fractional reserve banking is. Suppose I deposit $100 in Steve's bank, and then Steve lends, he keeps 10% reserve, and he lends 90 to Sanjay. He gives me, I put my money in his bank. He gave me a demand deposit for $100. He lent the money to Sanjay. He gave Sanjay a demand deposit for $90. Steve now owes 190, and he's only got 10. These are demand deposits, not lottery tickets or anything. And if we both come in there at the same time and want our money back, he doesn't have it. He's shown to be bankrupt, that he is right now, because the way Murray Rothbard defines bankruptcy is when your instantaneous debts are bigger than your instantaneous assets. He's only got $10. He owes 190. And if you carry this forward with a 10% fractional reserve, you get $1,000 on 100. It's a multiplier of 10. So I think Steve misconstrues. There is a debate among Austrians. Selgin and White are sort of Austrians, although Selgin now renounces it, White doesn't. So that's one area where we disagree. Another area where we disagree is the question of how significant is the Austrian business cycle theory. And here, me, Bob Murphy, and Bill Barnett have a series of articles with Andy Young. Andy Young of West Virginia happens to be a former undergraduate student of mine, and I keep threatening to lower his grade, and he just laughs at me because he already has his PhD, so I can't lower his grade. It's just being silly. I think the Austrian business cycle theory is apodictic. Whether it applies to anything or not is certainly an empirical issue. But Steve sort of wonders how Murray Rothbard's book, The 1929 Depression, can have so much statistical data. And he talks about Murray the historian versus Murray the apodictic theoretician. There really is no conflict between the two. Apodictic theory is necessarily true, but we Austrians do from time to time engage in empirical research, not to test those theories, but to illustrate them. And that's what Murray is doing. For example, when I say a minimum wage law of $20 an hour is going to unemploy people, that's apodictically true. And then what we do is go out and measure states that have higher and lower minimum wages and try to see if there's any correlation, which would illustrate but not violate, not test the theory. He talks about cartelization. As if Rothbard opposes cartelization. And here we get into another market failure, not business cycle, but what do you call it? Antitrust and monopoly theory and cartelization. Let me tell you my antitrust joke. It's a two-part joke, and I think this is based on Murray Rothbard's insights. There were 3 prisoners in the Soviet Gulag, and they were comparing notes as to why they're in prison. And one guy said, well, I came to work late, and they accused me of cheating the state out of my labor services. The other guy said, I came to work early, and they accused me of brown-nosing you know what brown-nosing this crosses. And the third guy said, I came to work every day exactly on time, and they accused me of owning a Western wristwatch. And the point is, no matter what you do in the Soviet gulag, you're in trouble. Well, it's the same thing with antitrust and cartelization. If you charge higher prices, they accuse you of gouging or profiteering. You charge lower prices, they accuse you of predatory price cutting. Charge the same prices, they accuse you of cartelization. So the thing is dead from the neck up. A legitimate law, I mean, if you rape and you're caught, you go to jail, and if you don't rape, you don't go to jail. Namely, rape is a legitimate law, but antitrust is not. And to think that Murray Rothbard buys into this argument through cartelization is problematic. You know, there is this expression, if you're so right, how come you're not rich? Why didn't I fly here in a private jet? Why did I have to take air transportation from Qantas or American Airlines? Austrian economics doesn't guarantee that you're going to be rich, because we don't know which side of the bed Barack Obama is going to get out of, or what Bernanke is going to do. Austrians have no any better role on that than anyone else. Now, Peter Schiff and other people have made a lot of predictions that came out true, as did Ron Paul, and I think Austrian economics helps, but it's certainly no guarantee, because there's a gigantic difference between apodictic certainty and applying it to the real world, where so many other things occur. Steve says that we're only against monetary policy. We should also be against Freddie and Fannie and HUD and other things like that. But I did mention in my opening lecture about 15 other things that the Austrians oppose. So I don't think that that's appropriate. Why do we have monetary policy? We don't have carrot policy. We don't have wristwatch policy. We don't have shoe policy. These policies, they did in the Soviet Union. They had toilet paper policy, they had steel policy, they had agricultural policy. You don't need policy. If you're going to have laissez-faire capitalism, the only function of the government is to make sure that property rights are upheld and contracts are upheld. You don't need any policy. Having a monetary policy is the Sovietization of a very important part of our economy, namely the monetary sphere, which interacts with all of our interactions, our financial interactions, apart from barter. So we don't blame everything on monetary policy. We say we shouldn't have a monetary policy, but there are other things that the government does. And talking about blaming government, I like to blame government on everything. I blame government on the weather, and I blame government for cancer, and I blame government for bad breath, and I blame government for everything. My reasoning is that these illegitimi, these bad people, they take half the GDP. And what do they do with half the GDP? They just, I don't know, waste it. They fritter away on welfare and warfare. And if they didn't, and if we had that, maybe we would have been colonizing the moon and curing cancer and not having depressions and not having any of these other things. Look, you know, everyone says Hoover was the right-winger and a conservative, and he did nothing. Well, this has been shown not to be true. There was a Hoover New Deal and there was an FDR New Deal. FDR ran against Hoover for being too interventionist, and then he became very interventionist. Getting back to what I was saying, there are malinvestments in long-term goods. And what the government should do, first of all, do nothing. Secondly, lower taxes, because if you lower taxes, then people have more money and they can save more money, and you can justify these malinvestments in long-term things like houses and cars. And instead, what FDR does is try to prop up prices. FDR would invite businessmen down there and say, do not lower wages. But as every Economics 101 student knows, that if wages are above the equilibrium, namely the supply of labor is greater than the demand for labor, that's unemployment. So wages have to come down. Housing prices have to come down. Instead, what they're doing is supporting it. There's this Lilly-Ledbetter Act in the US where you support women's wages because, as we know, the market is sexist and racist and everything else ist. This is just a way of propping up prices. This is a way of lengthening the Depression. The 1921 depression never occurred much, or it was over in a couple of months, whereas Obama sort of is tuning in on FDR. I think that Obama's mentor is FDR, and FDR extended that depression, and World War II did not get us out of the depression. That's just the broken window fallacy of which Hazlitt disposed of and Bastiat before him. It was because, look, the budget in 1946 went down by a third, and all the Keynesians were predicting that we would have a depression, and 1946 was a boom year. Thanks for your attention. I'm out of time. I'll turn it over to Steve again.
So we heard that Friedman was a Keynesian. I would like to suggest that the Austrian and Keynesian traditions actually have a lot more in common with each other than the Austrian tradition has in common with the general equilibrium tradition represented by the Chicago School. This, of course, was the school in which I was trained, and one of the things that we learned was that macro policy didn't work. And it didn't work because of good rational expectations arguments. And I would suggest this is actually a far more powerful critique of both monetary and fiscal policy than the idea that either is massively destabilising for the economy. So if you think about macroeconomic policy instruments, I mean, if they were effective, why would we ever need to have a recession? I mean, you would just pull the relevant policy levers, smooth out the business cycle, and the recession would go away. So the fact that we experience these recessions despite the best efforts of policymakers is very good evidence for the ineffectiveness of these policy instruments. In terms of the interest rate as the mechanism, both for the Austrian business cycle theory and many other interpretations of how monetary policy is transmitted to the economy, I don't accept the idea that the sort of changes that we've seen in interest rates, whether it be in the United States or in Australia, have been all that significant in terms of economic activity, because I just don't think there's much of a relationship between the interest rates set by the central bank and the market-determined interest rates at which people actually borrow. I was at a meeting recently with Joe Hockey, who, for Walter's benefit, is kind of the Australian shadow Treasury Secretary. And he was trying to suggest that there was a problem with the Chinese buying Australian government securities, because this might give the Chinese some influence over Australia's interest rates. And I said to Joe, look, the Chinese don't even control their own interest rates, much less ours. So I think we should be very careful about looking at changes, especially in the nominal interest rate in the United States or in Australia, and concluding from that that there's been a huge economically significant change in the intertemporal price of consumption. Friedman always told us that what you need to look at is the real interest rate, and in particular the expected real interest rate. So Walter mentioned the distinction between Selgin-White free banking on the one hand and the anti-fractional reserve bank tradition that Walter is sympathetic to. I think the reason why Selgin and White tend to favour their particular model of free banking over the critique of fractional reserve banking is partly because we actually have some historical experience with the Selgin-White model. And my approach to this issue is essentially to say, what sort of monetary system would we have if people were freely choosing? So in other words, if we abolished central banking, what monetary system would we expect to freely evolve? And in a sense, that's a very difficult question to answer in the absence of doing it. But I think something like the Selgin-White model, something like the Black-Famo-Hall model is much more likely to emerge spontaneously through a sort of Nozikian process than a system that outlawed fractional reserve banking. And I always found Rothbard kind of unconvincing on this, because he always faced the problem, well, what would happen if you had these capitalist acts between consenting adults that led to financial institutions doing fractional reserve banking? And I think it's in his 100% gold monograph where Rothbard speculates that there would be anti-fractional reserve bank vigilante leagues who would somehow go around and punish people for setting up fractional reserve banking systems, even if this was the outcome of mutually consenting, voluntarily transacting individuals. Walter mentioned the work of Andrew Young, one of his former students. I'm very glad that you didn't mark him down while he was a student. I think the sort of empirical work he's been doing, trying to establish the empirical validity of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, is exactly what Austrians should be doing. Even if you don't believe in empirical validation yourselves, if there's such a strong relationship between the monetary system and central bank policy on the one hand and the business cycle on the other, it should be fairly straightforward to show this statistically. And why not do it for the benefit of people who do accept statistical methods, even if you don't accept those methods yourself? You'll certainly be far more convincing to a wider audience. On the cartelisation issue, I didn't mean to suggest that Rothbard was a supporter of anti-cartel measures in terms of antitrust. But as I think Walter would agree, the sort of cartelisation of the economy that was engineered by the US government, partly as a response to the Great Depression, was certainly a factor in prolonging that episode through preventing the adjustment in prices. And I think that the mainstream of the economics profession has actually caught up with Rothbard on this particular question. So in terms of Freddie and Fannie, I think if you look at the recent financial crisis, you can give an explanation for this that is almost completely non-monetary. So you can point to the actions of Freddie and Fannie and the alphabet soup of government housing programs in the lead up to the financial crisis and very easily explain the oversupply in the US housing market. This gets transmitted to the rest of the world through the securitization of these mortgages. And so we've got a very powerful critique of government policy as a driver of the financial crisis that really doesn't rely in any way, shape or form on bashing the Federal Reserve. And I think that the focus that has been put on the Federal Reserve by Austrians and by Ron Paul has really diverted much needed attention away from these far more serious interventions that have far more serious consequences.
There's something more important than contracts, even voluntary consenting adult contracts. Those are good. I'm sort of vaguely in favor of them, but not necessarily so. There's something much more important than contract, and that's property rights. Property rights undercut or undergird contract. Look, there are certain contracts that are consensual that are illegitimate. Murder contract. I hire Gerardo to kill somebody else. That's an invalid contract, even though he and I agree. The third guy doesn't agree. What about a contract to deliver a pink elephant or a unicorn, given that there are no such things? That's an invalid contract, even if people agree. What about a contract, I'll sell you a square circle. Want to buy one? $10. Cheaper than one of my books. There's no such thing as a square circle. You can't have a contract with square circles. Well, I think that the same thing is true with fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is look, why do they call it demand deposits? Why don't they call it a lottery ticket? If they would call it look, we're not against lottery tickets. In the article that Hans Hoppe and Guido Holtzman and I co-authored, we talk about fractional reserve parking lots. What's that? It's a place where you have 300 spots and you sell 500 tickets. But you don't sell demand deposit tickets to the spots. What you sell is a fishing license or a hunting license. You say, look, this entitles you to go search, and if you can find a parking spot, fine. And if you can't, you're out of luck. But if you sold there was this great movie, The Producers by, not Zero Mostel, where they sold 10,000% of the play. You can't do that. That's fraud. And it should be illegal. Because just because people agree to something, if they agree to something that is patently against property rights, which is the basic premise of everything, just because people agree to it doesn't matter. And if somehow it were agreed to, they would be punished by clearinghouse, interactions. If there was 100% bank reserve and Steve had a 10% reserve, we would just call forth payment, and he would be shown to be bankrupt. There was this movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Remember that one where angels, I'm sorry? Jimmy Stewart was in that. And there was a bank run. Now, there are now laws against fomenting bank runs. Selgin and White are weak on this one. In my book, Defending the Undefendable, we talk about, libel and slander. You'd be slandering a bank by saying it's a fractional reserve bank, and therefore it can't pay all its obligations. The punishment would be, in Murray Rothbard's view, if it were allowed, which it shouldn't be according to libertarian theory, there would be negative clearinghouse obligations and all the fractional reserve banking. Well, maybe if the fraction were 99%. But Selgin and White talk about 1%. That's just a recipe for disaster. Yes, HUD and Fannie and Freddie and a whole bunch of other people screwed around with housing, and as I said, the mainstream was pretty good on that. But we have depression in other areas as well, not just housing. Automobiles, we had to bail them out. We had banking failures, they had to bail out Wall Street. So HUD and Fannie and Freddie can only account for housing. Well, what about the rest of the depression, the rest of the recession that we've got? You can't explain those on the basis of just housing. Steve makes a not unreasonable point that the interest elasticity, if I can put words in his mouth, of investment isn't that high. Well, it depends upon, interest elasticity means how much will investment change when interest rate changes. It all depends upon the length of time you take. I mean, if you look at an instantaneous elasticity, you're not going to get much. But the point I was making has nothing to do with interest rate elasticity of investments. Rather, it has to do with the fact that when you lower the interest rate by 1%, from 4 to 3%, you got gigantic differences in incentives to invest long-term and short-term. And that's got nothing to do with interest rate elasticity. Selgin and White, or I think it was White, not Selgin, made the point that there were no bankruptcies in any bank in Scotland, where he did his analysis of the Scottish banking system for a century or two. And Murray Rothbard said, well, why is that so good? The reason it's so good, the reason we don't want any bank to fail is because they're all fractional reserve. It's sort of like a house of cards. You hit one card and they all fall. Unless you have the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the US, I'm sure you have some equivalent out here. And how do they guarantee the fractional reserve banking will be viable? By printing it up. I mean, they'll just print and print and print, or add zeros electronically nowadays. But that's recipe for Zimbabwe or Germany in 1923 with the hyperinflation. So Murray Rothbard says, what's so great about banks not failing? I mean, restaurants fail sometimes. It's part of the healthy part of the system that sometimes you have failures. And if you don't have any failures, that's not part of the market. I'm happy that Steve says that monetary policy has not much of an effect. And he says, well, if it's ineffective, well, then why do we have it? Maybe we can agree, if it's ineffective, let's get rid of it. Let's go back to the gold standard. Let's not have a Fed. But he says we should have a Fed, so I'm puzzled.
So I'll say a little bit more about the sort of competing models in relation to free banking. I think that the Hayek's idea that if you remove barriers to entry to competition in terms of currency, then you've solved a large part of the problem, because then people can freely choose what media of exchange and unit of account they might use for the purposes of their transactions. And it strikes me that we're now living in a world which is very close to this Hayekian model of free banking, in that we do actually have a large degree of choice in terms of the unit of account and media of exchange that we use. I mean, the only sense in which we're compelled to use a particular unit of account or medium of exchange is when we pay the government our tax bill, but the rest of the time we actually have a considerable degree of choice. And I'm sort of always puzzled when I go on Amazon.com and I see Ron Paul's books for sale, and they're for sale in US dollars. If Ron Paul is so convinced that the US dollar is on the verge of collapsing or being worthless because of the depredations in terms of monetary policy, surely he should be requesting payment in some other currency. So on the sort of model of free banking, I'm kind of agnostic. I think you get rid of the barriers to entry to competition, you let the market work and see what spontaneously emerges. In terms of the my position on central banking, yes, I'd be quite happy to see central banking done away with, because as I suggested, I don't think it's particularly effective in stabilising economic activity. There is, of course, there are different functions which the central bank can perform, and so in terms of abolishing the monetary policy function, that still leaves a lot of other functions available for the central bank to perform, and so it's a somewhat separate issue as to how we deal with those. The thrust of my comments today was just to suggest that if you're arguing that monetary policy is hugely destabilising, what you're saying is that monetary policy must be very effective. And if you're saying that monetary policy is very effective, then this opens up scope for someone to come along and say, well, all we need to do is to do it better. Or put different people in charge who will make different decisions, and then we'll get the economic outcomes that we want. And I think there are good reasons for not encouraging that particular point of view. The thrust of my argument today was to say that this idea that monetary policy is ineffective, we'd expect it to be ineffective when all the central bank is doing is acting as a price maker in a very narrow overnight interbank lending market, when its balance sheet is very small relative to the stock of marketable securities. These are much more powerful critiques that we can make of modern central banking, and I think will ultimately be more persuasive in winning people over to the idea that the monetary system should be as completely as possible market determined and endogenized with economic activity.